Next, a hearing on the government's handling of air quality and health issues at New York's Ground Zero following the September 11th attacks. In 2003, the EPA Inspector General released a report on the environmental impact and the agency's response after 9/11. Senator Clinton chairs the Senate Environmental Subcommittee hearing, which is over 2 hours.
The hearing will come to order, and I want to welcome all of you. We are expecting votes, and there was a lot of scrambling around trying to decide whether we would start the hearing and then go vote, or vote and then start the hearing. And so some of my colleagues who will join me later will try to figure out. The time has been changed, so we're not quite sure exactly when the vote will occur, but we want to go ahead and get started. And I thank you all for being here. I know there are a number of New Yorkers in the audience, and I welcome all of you, Kimberly Flynn and Joseph Jones and Jenna Orkin and Marvin Bethay and Barbara Einzig and everyone else. This is the first hearing of the Subcommittee on Superfund and Environmental Health, and it is entitled EPA's Response to 9/11 and Lessons Learned for Future Emergency Preparedness. Also in the audience is my friend and colleague and someone who has been a real leader on these issues, Congressman Jerry Nadler. This follows a hearing that I chaired in the Help Committee earlier this year in March to address the urgent health needs of the thousands of first responders, workers, volunteers, and residents who have suffered illnesses because of the toxins to which they were exposed following the attacks of 9/11. It is a companion hearing to the one that Congressman Nadler will hold on the House side next week. We will first hear testimony from a federal panel that includes EPA, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and the Government Accountability Office. We will then hear from a panel that includes a New York City resident and a scientific expert, both heavily involved in 9/11 contamination issues. And I'm delighted to be joined by the ranking member on this committee, Senator Larry Craig. And I thank you very much, Senator Craig, for coming. And my chairman of the full committee, Senator Barbara Boxer, as well as my friend and colleague, Senator Lautenberg. I really appreciate each of their interests in this issue, and of course, Senator Lautenberg and I share many constituents who have been suffering and even dying because of their exposures to the toxins at and around Ground Zero. I called this hearing because it is time for answers. Nearly 6 years after 9/11, we still don't have the whole truth about the toxic cloud of poison that filled the air after the towers fell. We don't have an explanation for the misrepresentations that put countless people at risk of exposure to chemicals that we know are causing illness and death. When we turned to our government in Washington for guidance in the hours, days, and weeks after that tragedy, one of the questions people asked was obvious and important: is the air safe? And what did EPA tell us? On September 18, 2001, Governor Whitman said, and I quote, "I'm glad to reassure the people of New York and Washington, D.C., that their air is safe to breathe and their water is safe to drink." Now, based on EPA statements, parents sent their children to school in the area, residents returned to their apartments, but as the EPA Inspector General informed us in 2003, the EPA statements were, and I quote, "not supported by the data available at the time." Now, I recognize that EPA and everyone else involved were operating under unprecedented and extremely difficult circumstances, but I simply cannot accept what appears to have been a deliberate effort to provide unwarranted reassurances at the direction of the White House to New Yorkers about whether their air was safe to breathe. I well remember my first visit to Ground Zero the day after 9/11. You could feel it on your skin. The air was acrid and thick. You could taste it. You certainly could smell it. Back in Washington, I went to work pushing then Administrator Whitman to address environmental hazards from the 9/11 fallout and to hold hearings in New York City on the issue in February of 2002. I pushed for EPA to address the indoor contamination issue and fought for the administration to address the shortcomings identified in the first cleanup program, leading to a commitment to establish the EPA World Trade Center Expert Technical Review Panel in 2003. I've also worked to secure funding for programs to provide medical screening and tracking for first responders. And I'm very pleased that the Senate Labor, HHS, Education, and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee has approved a bill yesterday to provide an additional $55 million in federal funding to address the mounting health needs of those who are exposed to environmental hazards. And for the first time, we were able to secure bill language requiring the Department of Health and Human Services through NIASH to extend the program to residents, students, and others impacted by the toxins. And I want to thank Senators Harkin and Specter for including this in the legislation. The reason I've worked so hard on these issues is because of heart-rending stories of people like Felicia Dunn Jones, and members of her family are here with us. In May, the New York City medical examiner reversed an earlier decision and ruled that the death of Felicia Dunn Jones was connected to her exposure on 9/11, the first such ruling in New York, and we already had a ruling by the coroner in New Jersey connecting the death of an NYPD detective to his exposure. Felicia Dunn Jones was a 42-year-old lawyer who'd worked near the World Trade Center. In February of 2002, she passed away from sarcoidosis, often associated with environmental hazards. Her husband, Joe, who lives in Staten Island with his 2 children, is here today, as is Felicia's sister, Sharon Alvarez. She was caught in the toxic cloud, and her story recognizes how difficult the balance has been of scientific and medical evidence, but it is shifting, showing that increased exposure to 9/11 toxins actually can cause illness and death. The first responders were the first to see the effects. Within 2 months of the attacks, 300 firefighters were on medical leave, suffering with lung ailments. Subsequent research has shown this was just the first sign of persistent health problems. More than 11,500 firefighters and 3,000 emergency medical technicians and paramedics took part in the greatest rescue ever mounted. We know that thousands are now suffering from adverse health effects. According to fire department studies, exposed firefighters on average experienced a decline in lung function equivalent to what would have been produced by 12 years of aging. More than 34,000 employees of the New York Police Department participated in rescue, recovery, and cleanup operations at Ground Zero or fresh kills where the debris from the disaster was taken. More than 2,000 members of the police department have filed medical claims. The rescue and recovery efforts were assisted by heavy machine operators, laborers, iron workers, building and construction tradespeople, telecommunication workers, and others from the public and private sector. Researchers at Mount Sinai Medical Center have documented physical and mental health effects among this population, with 69% reporting new or worsened respiratory symptoms experienced while at Ground Zero, and 59% still experiencing persistent health effects more than 2 years after the attacks. Almost 60,000 residents live in the vicinity of the World Trade Center, south of Canal Street in Lower Manhattan. The dust and debris settled in many of the apartments and buildings in the vicinity of the attacks. An analysis of more than 2,000 residents in the area found 60% experienced the onset of respiratory symptoms, a rate approximately 3 times higher than that of people in a surrounding area in Manhattan. In addition, students at Stuyvesant High School in Lower Manhattan, who were evacuated because of their proximity to the World Trade Center, resumed classes 1 month after the attacks. They had rates of respiratory and other illnesses higher than those at other New York City high schools. Sadly, some of these illnesses were not preventable, as the toxic dust cloud literally enveloped many people as they fled from the scene. But many who were exposed could have been protected. That's why it's important we examine what went wrong. Americans deserve to know what we can do to better protect them. And we have a number of questions. First, why did the Bush administration, EPA, and CEQ management choose to downplay and grossly misrepresent the exposure health risks posed in the days and weeks after 9/11? Second, the EPA's own Inspector General blasted the EPA's program to clean up indoor contamination, but 4 years later, the EPA is making the same mistakes again. Third, have EPA and CEQ learned lessons from the disaster and are better prepared to protect public health from environmental hazards in the future? To me, it's clear from the GAO testimony that some lessons are being ignored, and I don't want us to repeat the mistakes. We can never repay those who sacrificed for us, who answered the call of duty. We cannot go back in time and pull the brave men and women off that pile or order them to wear respiratory protection equipment. We can't tell the residents, the first responders, the workers, and the volunteers that the air is too dangerous to breathe. But we can clear the air here in Washington and clear the way to help those affected and to hold accountable those who did let New Yorkers and Americans down, to learn the lessons that we should to be fully prepared for the unthinkable. And that's why I have called today's hearing. Let me turn now to the ranking member on this subcommittee, Senator Larry Craig.
Madam Chairman, the vote has just started, and I certainly will get us under the wire. But again, along with the Chairman, I want to thank all the witnesses today for joining us to examine the lessons learned from 9/11 and EPA's preparedness for future emergencies. Certainly, reviewing the past is critically important for any of us if we're going to be prepared for the future. Most, if not all of us, can tell the story of where we were and what we were doing when we first learned of the tragic events of 9/11. The aftermath of the Twin Towers collapse showed an inspiring level of heroism and teamwork, literally unprecedented, I think, in our history. These unimaginable circumstances also highlighted emergency response successes and shortcomings. And that's what we are talking about here today. I think it's important to review the lessons we've learned, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. In reviewing the reports within the scope of this hearing, it appears to me that criticisms largely hover around outdoor air health advisories, as well as indoor air health and clean programs. The IG report released on August 21, 2003 regarding EPA's response to the World Trade Center collapse states, although many organizations were involved in addressing air quality concerns resulting from the World Trade Center collapse, subsequent events have demonstrated that ultimately the public, Congress, and others expected EPA to monitor and resolve environmental issues even when EPA may not have had the overall responsibility to resolve these issues or the necessary resources to address them. Later the report states EPA does not have clear statutory authority to establish and enforce health-based regulatory standards for indoor air. As you can see, Madam Chairman, there is a serious disconnect, or it appears there is a serious disconnect between what the public and some public officials have as expectations to EPA's ability and the actual authority granted to the agency. And I believe this disconnect should be addressed. I think it's appropriate and it is clearly necessary. Additionally, there are differing opinions regarding the current status of the indoor air test and clean program and what actions can be taken that are prudent for a safety health safety health standpoint, but that still maintain a level of fiscal responsibility. In other words, what's reality, what can we do, what is the statutory ability to do it, and what does it cost? Although it has been less than 6 short years since this tragedy, I'm interested to hear more about the programs EPA instituted as a result of the experience, such as the creation of the Office of Emergency Management and the National Decontamination Team and the expansion of the Environmental Response Team, among others. One last thing, Madam Chair. It has been brought to my attention that due to past litigation surrounding these issues aimed at Chairman Cunnington, he may be unable to answer all of the questions, and so I ask that we at least be cognizant to any legal situation that may exist, and I'm confident he'll respond to that. With that, Madam Chairman, I'd like to thank you for holding the hearing. It's an important hearing, And I'll conclude this statement by saying, let us always review where we've been to know where we need to get and the realities of what happened and how we might change them that are within the scope of the law or our responsibility, Madam Chairman, in adjusting the law to bring it into, allow agencies to move in directions that we might otherwise thought they had the authority to move in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Craig, and I look forward to working with you on those issues. Senator Boxer, Chairwoman Boxer.
Thank you so much, Senator Clinton, for holding this important hearing, but also for your focus on this very moral issue and your leadership. Nearly 6 years after the attacks of 9/11, the events of that horrific day are seared in our memories. We will never forget the collapse of the towers into a billowing cloud that swallowed up thousands of people. Who can forget those brave firefighters and police officers charging into the smoking buildings and disappearing into the choking cloud? And we remember now the fine gray dust that covered everything. And then we learned that that fine gray dust was toxic. It contained lead, asbestos, and other dangerous materials. We're here today because we owe it to the families of those who died, those who are still sick, and their families to ask questions that need to be answered about our government's response. It is our responsibility, which you are making sure we carry out, Madam Chair, to ensure that EPA and the rest of the executive branch carry out the laws that we pass, including our environmental laws. And we now have a chance to take a look at how we did. I am here to support Senator Clinton's efforts to oversee the government response. She is my full confidence. She's been a true leader on this issue, and she has worked to make sure that this committee stays on track and doesn't look away from this disaster. As in the case of many lesser disasters, we only learn afterwards what the extent of the danger was to the people who were there. And there are continuing concerns about the health of many people exposed to the toxins I described. I believe that the government has a responsibility to level with the public about everything they know about the risks. If there are dangers, let's be honest about them. Government should never downplay or cover up danger. I am concerned about allegations that officials at EPA and from the White House twisted the facts and misleadingly reassured the public about the health risks after the 9/11 attack in New York. Senator Clinton reiterated just one sentence from Administrator Whitman, which was reassuring and which was wrong. After such disasters and health emergencies, the government also must ensure that we quickly and properly clean up the contamination. The government did mobilize substantial resources after 9/11, but we will hear testimony about some shortcomings in the response, especially with respect to the toxic dust that coated the indoors of many residences and businesses, among other issues. Finally, the government should assist those whose health is hit hardest, especially the first responders and the most severely exposed citizens, to ensure that their health is monitored and protected. This is an ongoing concern after the World Trade Center attacks and other disasters when first responders and other citizens are highly exposed to toxic chemicals and materials. Senator Clinton took the lead in getting a provision enacted in the Safe Ports Act last Congress that helps mobilize health tracking after a disaster. And I want to announce today that she and I are working with Senator Baucus on a broader bill to make sure that in any disaster, a federal disaster, there is follow-up and there is monitoring and there is help for those exposed, those workers exposed. And I hope the administration will work with us on this. We reach out to them today to do that. Unfortunately, this administration failed to level with many people in the aftermath of the attack. In 2003, the EPA's Inspector General found that the White House Council on Environmental Quality reviewed and changed EPA's statements in order to downplay the health risks associated with contamination in public statements. The Inspector General said, and I quote, "The White House Council on Environmental Quality influenced the information that EPA communicated to the public through its early press releases when it convinced EPA to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones." Twisting facts to encourage a false sense of security can harm people and erode the public's trust in government. This is the Inspector General report. This isn't a political report. Government should rely on science and act in the best interest of its citizens, not spin the evidence. And so I am so pleased that we have the opportunity to shed more light on these critical issues and right the wrongs that have been done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Lautenberg, we will go and vote and tell them to wait until you get there so you can deliver.
I feel like the last man standing here,
How many minutes are left?
Senator Clinton, to collapse my minutes and wonder whether or not I'm going to miss a vote is not something I really want to do.
Well, then why don't we recess now, and we'll all go vote, and we'll come back, and then you can give your opening
I
statement.
really prefer that.
Okay?
I appreciate it.
Okay,
I
so,
thank the witnesses.
so we will be in recess. Hearing will come to order. We have been joined by Senator Inhofe, and we will now go to Senator Lautenberg for his opening statement, and then Senator Inhofe, if you have an opening statement. Senator Lautenberg.
As a, if you want to, Madam Chairman, while I hunt for a page here, if Senator Inhofe is, thank you.
I am ready.
Okay. Swords dangling, and we're, thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you those who are appearing at the witness table for your indulgence while we took care of our voting responsibility. On September 11th, 2001, more than 3,000 people lost their lives, including 700 New Jersey residents. What was not obvious at the time, but apparent now, is the damage from the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings that extended beyond that immediate territory that fateful day. Now, 6 years later, the health of thousands of first responders, search and rescue workers, volunteers who rushed to Ground Zero, many, once again, from my home state of New Jersey, continues to decline. Residents and office workers from some distance away from those buildings have also fallen ill. Their illnesses were caused by toxic dust that they inhaled in the days and the weeks after the attack. Many of those people are now suffering from respiratory problems, reduced lung functions. Many of the firefighters who were there can no longer conduct their duties, as has happened with other workers as well, and many have died. Some of those who died from inhaling, one of those who died from inhaling the toxic dust was Joseph Zadroga, a decorated New York City detective from New Jersey. He was only 34 years old. Those who worked, lived, or volunteered New Ground Zero in the aftermath of the attack had every right to expect their government to provide honest, accurate, and complete information about the environmental conditions and health consequences in New York City. And so it's disturbing to me that they were let down by the administration's people. After the attack, the EPA downplayed the health risks posed by the toxic air and dust the towers released when they collapsed. In 2003, a report by the EPA Inspector General found that EPA statements misled the public about the safety of the air. Misled means that they had knowledge beforehand, and the White House rewrote EPA's press releases to minimize the health risks. The administration should have focused on educating the public and protecting them from the threats to their health. They certainly would do it if it was a volcano or some other thing that produced toxic materials as a consequence. Since 9/11, the EPA has conducted testing and cleaning on apartments and buildings near some apartments and buildings near the World Trade Center. But its approach has been criticized, including by an expert panel convened by EPA, as insufficient to protect the public health almost 6 years after 9/11. It's outrageous that EPA still has not gotten the message clearly. And it's infuriating to think that people who were doing their duty, trying to save others, and those who were innocent bystanders are now threatened with illnesses that are debilitating and life-shortening. So, Madam Chairman, I thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses how this program should be improved, and hoping that they will give their fullest response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lautenberg. Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The devastation of New York that it suffered on September 11th is just unprecedented and horrendous. And as in all of the presidentially declared disasters, EPA cooperated with as many federal departments to provide coordinated response. And this hearing is to examine EPA's response and future preparedness. And I would say, lessons learned. Following the September 11th, the EPA was highly involved conducting air, water, and dust monitoring in Lower Manhattan for environmental hazards. The EPA vacuumed street debris and disposed of hazardous waste. The EPA also conducted a voluntary cleanup program from 2002 to 2003 that served more than 4,000 residences in Lower Manhattan. Although the EPA does not ordinarily administer worker protection regulations, it provided respirators, protective gear for workers at the World Trade site. The EPA has received some criticism for its role following September the 11th. The EPA Inspector General released a lengthy report in 2003 alleging many problems with EPA responses. I'll provide you two brief examples. First, the EPA IG report alleged that EPA, OSHA, and the Council on Environmental Quality released misleading information to the public on air monitoring and sampling in press releases. However, in the same report, the IG conceded the EPA used many methods to inform the public, including public meetings, fact sheets, its website, interviews with newspapers, radio, TV, as well as through press releases. The IG concluded in the same report, in regard to the monitoring data, we found no evidence the EPA attempted to conceal results from the public. Secondly, although the IG was critical of the EPA's response, including its response to indoor environmental contamination, the IG concluded, and this is, I'm quoting again, the EPA's action to evaluate, mitigate, and control risks to human health from exposure to indoor air pollutants in the World Trade Center area were consistent with applicable statutes and regulations. I think quite often you get people who pick and choose statements out of reports that give a negative, and I want to make sure that we have the full information out here. Ultimately, the EPA IG report was incomplete because the IG did not interview other officials and other federal agencies, such as OSHA and the CEQ. Following the release of the 2003 EPA IG report, my staff prepared a report reviewing the IG's findings and interviewed EPA IG personnel, former acting Administrator Marianne Horinko, and the CEQ Chairman Jim Connaughton, and OSHA Assistant Administrator John Henshaw. And I request that those reports be made a part of the record. Now, during that time, I was the chairman of the committee, so we were very actively involved in this. Now, I also want to make a comment that normally I like to get information from people closest to the problem. And while the EPA IG was critical of the EPA's response, not all officials were critical in the responses to 9/11. Dr. Thomas Frieden, the New York City Commissioner of Public Health, testified at an EPW Clean Air Subcommittee hearing held in New York City in February of 2002. And I'm quoting now one of his statements, and in a minute I'll quote another one. One of the most vivid pictures to emerge is one of unprecedented cooperation between local, state, federal health, environmental, and occupational agencies. The teamwork is quite extraordinary. That was coming from the commissioner there in New York. I hope this hearing does not focus on the conflicting findings of a 4-year-old IG report. Instead, I hope this hearing provides legitimate congressional oversight on activities in which the EPA is currently engaged. In January of 2007, the EPA opened public registration for a new Lower Manhattan Test and Clean program. This program is designed to test for elevated levels of 4 contaminants associated with dust from the collapse of the World Trade Center. FEMA has provided $7 million to EPA for this work, and I understand that members of that expert panel, the CEQ and EPA, convened for this purpose and are dissatisfied that a more exacting program could not have been developed. However, I have an August 2006 letter from the same commissioner, the New York City Health Commissioner Frieden, stating, and I'm quoting, "The environmental investigation and testing conducted in Lower Manhattan indicates that potential health impacts from any remaining World Trade Center dust are extremely low or non-existing." And I ask unanimous consent that also be made a part of this record. We have witnesses that I know will shed further light on the many issues involving the World Trade Center and its aftermath, and I look forward to this, this committee hearing. And I had made 2 unanimous consent requests for inclusions in the record.
Without objection. I would now like to introduce our first panel. James Connaughton, Chairman, White House Council on Environmental Quality. Susan Bodine, Assistant Administrator, EPA Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. John Stevenson, Director of Government Accountability Office, Natural Resources and Environment Division. And Sven Rodenbach, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. I would just remind our panelists that your written testimony will be made a part of the record in full, and we ask that you limit your spoken testimony to 5 minutes. When the yellow light goes on, that means you have 1 minute remaining, and when the red light goes on, you've passed the 5-minute mark, so please, if you would, wrap your testimony up so we'll have time for questions. Mr. Connaughton, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Clinton, Ranking Member Craig. Nice to see you again, Senator Inhofe, and I'm sorry Senator Boxer isn't here, but I would acknowledge her. I've had a very good working relationship with her since she's taken the helm of the committee. I welcome the opportunity to testify today to once again go through the tragedy of September 11th, which was unprecedented in its scope. The physical, the psychological, and the social toll of that terrible act of terrorism was vast at the time, and it continues to this day. The complexity of the situation facing the local, state, and federal governments in responding to this terrorist attack was immense. The work by all was heroic, but I would particularly call out the work by the Environmental Protection Agency. I had a direct personal involvement on a day-to-day, hour-by-hour, in some cases minute-by-minute, with the folks in the field and the folks here in Washington, and I saw professionalism at its finest. I would note that many of the officials that are being discussed and the official actions being discussed at this hearing were undertaken by New Yorkers, federal government officials who were New Yorkers, federal government officials who were from New Jersey. Governor Whitman herself was the governor of New Jersey. Her own son was at the foot of the World Trade Center when the first plane hit and called to her by cell phone, something I know because I was in her office when that call came through. My own son that day spent the entire day at school thinking that I had been blown up by terrorists. And the look on his face when I returned at the end of that long day to find out that I was alive was a look that I will never forget. So the efforts undertaken by the government were not just professional, they were also passionate and deeply personal. And I think that's what this conversation is about. And that passion was singularly dedicated to the safety and well-being of the citizens of New York, of the rescue workers that came in from all over the country to help on that day, and the community, the broader community associated and the families associated with those individuals. Chairwoman Clinton, I particularly want to call out your leadership on this subject, as well as that of Senator Inhofe and Senator Lieberman in particular, in providing very constructive oversight over the last 5 years on this subject, and not just oversight, but sound good advice as we continue to cope with the aftermath of the terrorist attacks on New York City. I think you've been very thoughtful in the questions you've asked. I think you've been diligent in your pursuit of answers and your patience in getting the whole story. And most importantly, you've been very practical in working together and finding sensible solutions, and I'm glad that that continues. Turning first to the wide variety of risk communication issues, including those involving air quality, but recognizing that we had dozens and dozens of risk communication issues we were dealing with, the Environmental Protection Agency did its utmost to communicate the best available information accurately and in a timely fashion to meet the needs of Lower Manhattan residents, workers, and businesses. To that end, EPA worked very closely with the State of New York, the City of New York, OSHA, the Council on Environmental Quality, to ensure the safety, health, and well-being of the residents of Lower Manhattan. The federal government's communications in September of 2001 and subsequently were conveyed real-time in very fast-moving circumstances using a variety of approaches at a variety of levels. In all instances, the federal agencies acted with the best available data at the time and updated their communications and actions as new information was obtained. Many of the allegations that have been raised in the opening statements here have been gone over again and again over the last several years, but they really culminated in the Senate EPW oversight investigation, and then after that, in 2004, these were carefully gone over by the 9/11 Commission, which came to conclusions other than those being described in some of the opening statements that were made today. We all learned a great deal from September 11th, including how to improve federal response and communications efforts, but I would note those improvements happened real time in response to the episode itself. I mean, EPA did some amazing work in getting web-based access to resources. We had a level of interaction and coordination on communication that we had not had before. September 11th itself was an improvement on agency processes. And subsequent to that, the agencies have done numerous lessons learned exercises, and those were ultimately incorporated into their national approach to response at EPA. But more broadly, we saw very rapidly the establishment of the Homeland Security Council under Tom Ridge, as well as the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which has institutionalized within a very short period of time those lessons learned. With respect to the test and cleanup program, I just want to say again, Chairwoman Clinton, that I appreciated the opportunity to sit down with you in October 2003 to work out a plan for moving forward. I think our staffs worked very well together in quickly developing a workable strategy, identifying appropriate resources, and using an expert-led process with significant public involvement under the supervision and management of seasoned EPA professionals. Now, I've not been directly involved in that process since then, but EPA has briefed me from time to time on its progress, because I wanted to be sure, Madam Chairwoman, that we were keeping track on the arrangement that we had reached. And I'm pleased that the top dogs at EPA, Administrator Susan Bodine, accompanied by Assistant Administrator George Gray, are here today, who've been very closely associated with that effort. As we move forward, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee, I think this inquiry is useful. I think getting the full story is helpful, and I think we should continue to inform our efforts as we go forward. And I hope to never have to employ the processes that we employed on September 11th again on our soil, and I think we can all share that view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bodine.
Good morning, Madam Chairman, Senator Craig, members of the subcommittee. I'm Susan Bodine. I'm the Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. I'm accompanied here today by Dr. George Gray, who is EPA's Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development. And it was that office that coordinated the Test and Clean program with the city and with Region 2 of EPA. And thank you for the opportunity to be here to discuss both EPA's National Response Plan and our role in that plan, as well as EPA's support for the World Trade Center response. On September 11th, our country was attacked by terrorists. And there's a reason that we call them terrorists. They want to destroy our sense of security, they want to damage our economy, and they want to create fear. On 9/11, their overall mission failed. Today, America is stronger than ever. But these terrorist acts caused a great deal of pain and suffering. There are a lot of individual victims of 9/11. People who were trapped in the Twin Towers, or in the Pentagon, or on Flight 93. People who are caught in the initial dust cloud when the towers fell. The rescue workers who put their own lives at risk to help others. And the people who live and work in Lower Manhattan. Now, I'm very proud of our nation's response to this attack. And I'm sure, and I think it's already been discussed, some members of this Subcommittee went to Ground Zero and New York City in the days and weeks after the attack as part of your oversight responsibility. And the scene there was very impressive and very emotional. What you saw was everybody working together to do their utmost, both to help our nation recover from the attack and to help the victims. Now, the federal agencies that responded to the World Trade Center disaster did an incredible job working together under our National Response Plan. It was called the Federal Response Plan then, changed the name. And that was the overall framework for coordinating activities. As you know, the federal government's emergency authorities under the Stafford Act are activated when a governor requests the president to declare a major federal disaster. And then further, if at the time FEMA, now Secretary for Homeland Security, determines that the state and local resources are going to be so overwhelmed that it's an incident of national significance, then we can also trigger the structure of the National Response Plan to provide assistance. And the federal assistance is divided into 15 separate emergency support functions. Agencies have leads under emergency support functions as well as support roles. Now, EPA is the coordinator and primary agency under Emergency Support Function 10, which is Oil and Hazardous Substance Materials Response. On 9/11, that was the structure we were working under. FEMA activated Emergency Support Function 10. EPA received its first emission assignment on 9/11. EPA responded immediately. Our Region 2 headquarters are located in Lower Manhattan. We have one of our special teams, the Environmental Response Team, located in Edison, New Jersey. With these assets in place, we were there, EPA personnel were there on the very first day, and on the first day, they were already collecting air monitoring data for asbestos, lead, and volatile organic compounds. As each day passed, we expanded our sampling programs and monitoring programs, and ultimately took tens of thousands of samples and over 250,000 data points based on those samples. At that time, it was the most complex effort in the history of the agency. And at every step of the way, we were working not only with other federal agencies, but we were coordinating also with top scientific and medical experts, again, from all levels of governments and from the academic world. We pulled together teams of experts to establish benchmarks. We found ways of getting test results quickly. We found ways of getting them up on our website quickly and available to the public so everyone could see the data. In 2002, EPA also provided oversight and sampling for an indoor cleanup program that's going to be discussed today. And then in December 2006, EPA announced the availability of a further testing and cleaning in Lower Manhattan. And again, I know that that will be the topic of discussion today. But in my last few seconds, I want to summarize why I'm saying America's stronger than ever. You know, we've talked about lessons learned. We can always improve. And EPA now is even more prepared to respond. In 2003, we introduced our national approach to response that takes the view that it's the entire agency that needs to work together cohesively to respond to an emergency. That means we embraced the National Incident Management System, which is part of the National Response Plan. That means we've trained our people under Incident Command System, which again is part of the National Response Plan, so everybody knows what they're supposed to do when an emergency happens. We've added additional on-scene coordinators. We've created a West Coast environmental response team like the one in Edison that responded. We've created a national decontamination team. We've increased our response capacity by training over 2,000 people in Incident Command, as well as creating a response support corps. We've done a number of additional things. I don't have time. I could go in the written testimony. There's more detail. But I just want to make sure that you know that EPA today is better prepared to respond to any emergency, and we stand ready to support state and local governments when the next emergency happens.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bodine. Captain Rodenbeck.
Yes, good morning, Madam Chairman, members of the subcommittee, and my fellow panel members. My name is Captain Sven Rodenbeck. I'm a U.S. Public Health Service commissioned officer with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. Some of my responsibilities while stationed at ATSDR has been evaluating the public health impacts over 90 Superfund hazardous waste sites, and leading various high-profile agency responses to environmental health emergencies, including the World Trade Center and Hurricane Katrina and Rita responses. I am here today to provide you and the subcommittee with a briefing of ATSDR's support that was provided to the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, our participation on multiple World Trade Center task force, and our efforts to strengthen environmental health sciences and responses to environmental disasters. First, however, I would like to take this opportunity to remember all those that we lost on 9/11 and their families who continue to remember them and love them and their memories. I would also like to acknowledge the sacrifices that the countless responders, volunteers made on that day, some of whom are still suffering. I know I will always remember them. During the World Trade Center recovery efforts, ATSDR provided direct support to the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Our biggest contribution was the implementation of a pilot residential sampling program. The objective of that pilot program was to sample a small number of residential units to determine what the indoor and immediately surrounding outdoor environment had as far as residue dust. The sampling occurred from November 4 through December 11, 2001. The New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and ATSDR released preliminary sampling results on February 8, 2002, and provided the final report on October 4, 2002. Our primary finding of the pilot investigation was that levels of materials detected in the air and dust did not pose potential health hazards, provided that recommended cleaning measures were followed. ATSDR also participated on several World Trade Center-related task forces. From February 2002 through the summer 2003, we supported the EPA Task Force on Indoor Air in Lower Manhattan. This task force provided technical consultation to EPA Region 2 on several projects, including the initial EPA voluntary cleaning and sampling of residential areas, the cleaning demonstration project, and the selection of World Trade Center chemicals of potential concern. ATSDR also participated on the 2004-05 EPA Expert Technical Review Panel. To help strengthen the environmental health sciences, ATSDR published the 2002 Toxicological Profile for Synthetic Vitreous Fibers, also known as man-made vitreous fibers. We also convened an expert panel to gain a greater understanding of the toxicity of asbestos and man-made vitreous fibers, particularly the fibers that are sometimes called short fibers, those that are less than 5 microns in length. ATSDR's involvement on these various multi-agency World Trade Center task force has served as a template for our responses to future environmental disasters. The early establishment of these type of task force can improve the development and implementation of responses to the complex issues that arise from environmental disasters. An example of how this can be done is the 2005 CDC, ATSDR, and EPA Environmental Health Needs and Habitability Assessment Task Force, which provided the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans with a rapid scientific evaluation of the overarching environmental health issues that needed to be done before the city could be reoccupied. ATSDR also participated on the multi-agency task force that evaluated whether the storm surge from Hurricanes Katrina and Rita caused widespread sediment or soil contamination in the New Orleans area. Madam Chairperson, this concludes my testimony. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Captain. Mr. Stevenson.
Madam Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm here today to discuss GAO's ongoing review of EPA's second program to address indoor contamination from the World Trade Center. Our full report will be issued in September to you. As you know, the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center nearly 6 years ago turned Lower Manhattan into a disastrous site on a scale the nation had never experienced. As the towers collapsed, Lower Manhattan was blanketed in a mixture of building debris and combustible materials that coated building exteriors and streets, as well as the interiors of apartments and offices, exposing thousands of residents and workers to hazards in the air and in the dust, such as asbestos, lead, glass fibers, and pulverized concrete. To put EPA's efforts into perspective, Figure 1 in my statement, you should all have a copy of this, contains a timeline of EPA activity since 9/11. On the day of the attacks, the President signed a major disaster declaration which activated the Federal Government's assistance to State and local agencies. In May 2002, after numerous cleanups, dust collection, and air monitoring activities were conducted outdoors, New York City formally requested Federal assistance to test and clean indoor space in residences and common areas. As shown, EPA implemented the first program to test and clean indoor space about 1 year after the disaster. Residents of Lower Manhattan living south of Canal Street, about 20,000 apartments, were eligible to participate in the program, and about 20%, or 4,100 apartments, did so. However, EPA's first program was severely criticized. In August 2003, as has been mentioned, the EPA's Inspector General complained that the cleanup did not require that entire buildings be systematically cleaned, including HVAC systems, and concluded that the contaminants in uncleaned apartments and common areas could enter the air supply system and recontaminate clean spaces. In March 2004, EPA convened an expert technical review panel to address IG and public concerns about EPA's program. The panel met periodically over 18 months through December of 2005. EPA announced its second program to address indoor contamination in December 2006, over 3 years after completion of the first program, and only 295 of the over 20,000 eligible home and building owners have enrolled, compared to about 4,100 the first time. Madam Chairman, you asked GAO to evaluate EPA's second test and clean program to determine, 1, the extent to which EPA implemented recommendations from the IG, the expert panel, and others; 2, to determine the completeness of information EPA provided to the public about indoor contamination; and 3, to determine how EPA determined that $7 million was the appropriate amount to carry out the program. In summary, we found that EPA incorporated some recommendations into its second indoor air program, but its decision not to adopt others has limited, in our view, the overall effectiveness of the program. EPA did implement recommendations to expand the number of contaminants tested beyond asbestos, and did agree to test in dust as well as air. However, it did not incorporate recommendations to expand the boundaries of cleanup beyond Canal Street. EPA reasoned that it would need to identify a World Trade Center signature, that is, a method for differentiating between normal urban dust and World Trade Center dust, to justify expanding the program. But EPA was ultimately never able to identify such a signature, in part because it waited nearly 3 years to attempt to do so. EPA also did not incorporate recommendations to sample in HVACs and inaccessible locations within apartments and common areas, such as behind dishwashers, citing resource constraints. EPA also did not incorporate recommendations to expand the program to include workplaces, stating that worker safety is the responsibility of other agencies. We also found that EPA did not provide sufficient information to allow the public to make informed choices about the extent of contamination and ultimately their participation in the indoor program. For example, EPA publicly reported that a very small number of samples from its first program exceeded risk levels of airborne asbestos. However, it did not adequately explain that this conclusion was based on the fact that most testing was done after cleaning rather than before cleaning. This may have given residents a false sense of security and contributed to the low participation in the second program. Finally, we found no basis for the $7 million EPA identified to implement its second program. It was simply the money left over from the first test and clean program, and it's less than 20% of the first program's funding. EPA chose to limit the scope of the second program to fit within these available resources rather than to design a comprehensive program and then estimate the resources needed to carry it out. EPA told us that if the demand had exceeded available resources, it would have limited participation in the program rather than request additional resources. Madam Chairman, that concludes my summary, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. If I may begin by directing a series of questions to Mr. Connaughton, Chairman Connaughton. As you noted in your testimony, you and I did meet to discuss the findings of the 2003 Inspector General report because the report did raise a number of serious concerns, primarily White House interference with EPA's communications about air quality and flaws with EPA's indoor test and clean plan. And I appreciate that we reached an accommodation at that time on the indoor contamination issue in the form of your commitment to launch an expert panel to look into it. And we will explore the work of that panel and its results with other witnesses. But I think it is fair to say, Chairman Connaughton, that there remained a number of troubling issues raised by the EPA Inspector General about EPA's early statements about air quality. This is really an opportunity for you to respond to some of these, because I think in the area of lessons learned, the whole issue of how we communicate with the public is critical. Every study that I've read about how best to convey information to the public with respect to a disaster puts a very high priority on the quality of information, the accuracy of information, the validation of that information by independent sources. And certainly, the Inspector General found that EPA's early statements that the air was safe to breathe was incomplete. It lacked necessary qualifications and was not supported by the data available at the time. And let me just ask you, isn't it true that CEQ was involved in the drafting of those statements about air quality?
Yeah, that's right, Madam Chairwoman. Very soon after the attack, Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Bolton established a domestic consequences group that ensured that there would be significant coordination among the different agencies, federal agencies, in responding, not just in response, but also in communications and other issues associated with that, so that we were working in a coordinated manner. You had ATSDR, you had EPA, you had OSHA, you had the New York State Department of Health, you had the New York City Department of Health. There were a lot of entities that were ramping up to response, and it was clear that some level of organization and coordination was going to be necessary. And then not just with the response. What we were doing with the environmental response had to then also take into account we did not know if another attack was coming, and the National Security Council there needed to be a central node with them so that we could feed in the environmental piece of the equation while they were looking at some of the human health issues, while they were looking at some of the security issues, the first responder issues, to be sure that we were doing triage on the highest priorities, getting the information that we needed in order, and then being sure we were taking advantage of resources.
But let me ask you, Mr. Chairman, because the Inspector General goes on to say that the agency did not reflect in its statements the best professional advice of the agency's own experts. It appeared that the EPA's best professional advice was overruled when relaying information to the public in the weeks immediately following the disaster. And further, the AGA found that the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which you chair, influenced through the collaboration process, which you just described, the information that EPA communicated to the public through its early press releases when it convinced EPA to add reassuring statements and to delete cautionary ones. So let me ask, did you convince EPA to add reassuring statements and delete cautionary ones?
I think those characterizations by the Inspector General were incompletely formed and inaccurate.
Well, let me just show you. The EPA IG report contains several specific examples of these type of changes, and one of them is reproduced on a chart that I brought today. And let me see if it's impossible to read, but as the chart shows, a draft September 13th, 2001 press release stated that, and I quote, preliminary results of EPA's sampling activities, the thousands of samples that Ms. Bodine referred to, indicated no or very low levels of asbestos. However, even at low levels, EPA considers asbestos hazardous and will continue to monitor and sample for elevated levels of asbestos and work with appropriate officials to ensure awareness and proper handling, transportation, and disposal of potentially contaminated debris or materials. That was the original draft. The final release stated that, and I quote, EPA is greatly relieved to have learned that there appears to be no significant levels of asbestos dust in the air in New York City. We are working closely with rescue crews to ensure that all appropriate precautions are taken. We will continue to monitor closely. Public health concerns about asbestos contamination are primarily related to long-term exposure. Short-term, low-level exposure is unlikely to cause significant effects. There's a difference between the meaning and the impact of those. I mean, EPA originally said, however, even at low levels, EPA considers asbestos hazardous. So why did CEQ overrule EPA, an agency with considerably more staff and expertise about environmental hazards, and modify that press release?
Well, actually, the inverse was the case, Madam Chairwoman. We had daily and sometimes more than daily conference calls with the people from Region 2, as well as the people here in Washington, including CEQ, that were going over all of the communications and all of the data. What Mr. Thernstrom was doing was coordinating the output of those discussions. There were many, the people drafting the press releases were not necessarily the professionals who were providing advice on how to construe the data. And so the product, the final product of that one particular press release was the product of a much broader discussion among the public health professionals in the field and back here in Washington on how to make this one particular statement. The other thing that's important, Madam Chairwoman, this was one press release out of what were thousands and thousands of communications. We had a particular focus on the workers who faced extreme danger in the conditions in doing the recovery and rescue work. We had a second focus on the people who were acutely exposed to the volume of dust immediately after the collapse, and that really was in the hands of the public health professionals. And EPA was instrumental in encouraging people to go seek medical help and monitoring. And then there was the third category about the residents, the people who were distant from the immediate ground zero, but who were worried about the smell and the odor and all the things that you all know about, the visceral sense from the fires in the days that followed September 11th. And so what this one press release was the first statement regarding the ambient concerns, and it was specifically focused on the questions that came up with respect to asbestos.
Well, Mr.
The
Chairman,
data that we had in hand 5 days after monitoring started actually provided much greater reassurance. I have to tell you, all of us were relieved. We feared that there would be quite substantial amounts of asbestos that people might be directly exposed to. As it happens, the data was showing that that was not the case. And I think it is the statement in the final press release was the accurate one. It is the other formulations that we decided as a group that needed to be adjusted. So this is not your representation of overruling or not overruling and misleading. That doesn't capture the nature of the dynamic we had at the time. And we discussed this a bit in your office. And again, I'm happy to go into greater detail in that process.
well, Mr. Connaughton, would you, my time is up, I'm going to go to my colleagues, but would you be willing to answer more specific questions of the nature that would get to the bottom of this? Because there is, as you're well aware, other evidence, particularly concerning Mr. Thernstrom and some of his statements and some of the email exchanges between Region 2 and the CEQ and EPA here in Washington. And, you know, what we're trying to figure out is how to sort this out, because I think it is fair to say that many people in New York took the statements and were greatly relieved and reassured about them. If there had been a more accurate depiction, and I would argue that the first press release was more accurate, that low levels of asbestos exposure, to say nothing of everything else that was in the air, could pose health hazards, people could have made appropriate decisions. And that's where, you know, we're trying to get to the lessons learned here, and I believe we should always err on the side of giving as accurate a picture as possible so that people can make decisions for themselves. But let me move now to Senator Craig.
Actually, Senator, if I might just in one point, the 9/11 Commission did look at all of this very carefully, and they talked with all of us. They concluded that although the White House review process resulted in some editorial changes to the press releases, these changes were consistent with what the EPA had already been saying without White House clearance. What we're trying to do on that one press release that everyone's focused on is bring into one place what had been a constant flow of information on the ground directly to people. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't read press releases. I don't think the public was reading the press release. What it was follow-up by reporters who were getting more detail. There were outside people commenting on what the risks were. The New York Department of Public Health was making commentary on some of the human health issues. But what really, the most important communications were the one that Governor Whitman,
well,
for
Mr.
Region 2
Connaughton, I
officials
understand your position,
others
but it is also clear, and we should put into the record, there is a current lawsuit going on, which you're well aware of, and under oath, the judge has reached very different conclusions based on the testimony that's been provided so far, and gone to the extent of even calling Governor Whitman and others at the EPA misleading, and given great, emphasis to the way that this information was communicated, and done so, I think, based more accurately on the evidence that has been before it. But I would just appreciate, your willingness to provide additional information so that we could sort this out. Let me turn now to Senator Craig.
Madam Chairman, I'm going to yield to Senator Inhofe because of his schedule,
Yes,
and I'll come back.
Thank you very much, Senator Craig and Madam Chairman. Well, let me start off by recalling to memories around here that I chaired this committee during the years after 9/11. In fact, I was somewhat apologetic to you and others during that period of time because we had such intense oversight and so many questions, and you were always very, very cooperative, and I want to compliment you publicly on that, Chairman Connaughton. But let me ask you this question. Isn't it reasonable for a White House office such as CEQ to coordinate with federal agencies to involve and produce a common federal messages? And are there any issues about this you'd like to clarify concerning federal communications?
I think in the after reviews of what happened, I think the process that Deputy Chief of Staff Bolton put in place earned high praise. The fact that we were able to so rapidly create a coordination function that later became the Homeland Security Council, which also everybody was very strongly supportive of across the country, and the governors in particular. And so what we had going on was exactly what people would expect. You would hope that the President and the White House were on top of the situation and were actually coordinating to be sure that information was being obtained in a timely fashion. We were prioritizing those needs, and we were getting information out to the right people in the right place at the right time. And so as a participant in that process, I found it particularly effective. And everyone was throwing in their oars. I mean, we had flyovers we had satellite monitoring, we had airplane monitoring, we had on-the-ground monitoring. That information was coming in at a level of detail and a level of coordination that you typically do not see, and it's to be commended. It was really quite a good.
I'm glad you're clarifying that, because we had hearings involving all those other parties, and I thought it was done quite well. Let me ask, Mr. Stevenson, you heard my opening statement, a quote that I made from the New York City Health Commissioner Frieden. Well, here, I'll read it again. The environmental investigations and testing conducted in Lower Manhattan indicate that the potential health impacts from any remaining World Trade Center dust are extremely low or non-existent. Did you consult the New York City's Department of Health during the compilation of your report, and do you disagree or agree with that statement?
We did meet with them. They're talking about ambient air samples, I believe. We were looking specifically at indoor air and the second program in particular. So the sampling I was talking about took place on a voluntary basis from indoor apartments.
All right. And Captain Rodenbeck, let me ask you a question. Why don't you, first of all, define for some of us what dust signature is, and then I'll ask my question.
In this particular case, when we're talking about a dust signature, it's what is the makeup of the dust that may be unique to the original source. So in this case, we're talking about how was the building material that generated the dust different in a way so you could look at different samples and say, yes, this originated from World Trade Center.
All right. Now, were you able to do that? I understand that you were not able to complete the dust sampling to your satisfaction.
Not to our satisfaction, yes.
I see. But can you comment on whether you believe that the current testing and cleaning program is in a step in the right direction?
Without the dust signature, we cannot fundamentally answer the basic question that we all want to answer. Is there still World Trade Center dust out there at levels of health concern?
Ms. Bodine, you made the comment that you talked about lessons learned. Would you, I don't think you had a chance to elaborate any on that. Would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I wanted to point out one of the challenges during 9/11 was certainly trying to come up with benchmarks and sampling protocols and methods to address situations that the agency had not previously had to address. And the staff did a tremendous job of consulting with experts, drawing together expert opinion, and developing benchmarks and protocols. But certainly as a lesson learned, we know that we can today look and say, oh, what can we anticipate, what don't we know? And today we can start working on closing those information gaps. I mentioned that we had established a national decontamination team. One of their roles is of course to respond. They always have their bags packed. But it's also to identify data gaps and work with our national Homeland Security Research Center, which is in Cincinnati. It's one of Dr. Gray's labs, to work together to do research to close some of those data gaps. In addition, we have been developing a network of environmental laboratories because, again, one of the issues during 9/11 and even more so during Katrina was just the vast amount of data we collected, and it became a capacity issue. Collecting data and having the labs that are there able to analyze it in a sufficient time to then provide good information to the public and provide good information to officials who need to make decisions. So we've been working with laboratories around the country, again, to establish common protocols so that we have good information, we have information that is of high quality, so that when the next disaster hits, we have that capacity.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Senator Craig, for helping accommodate my schedule.
Senator Lautenberg.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's obvious that there are different memories of things that were done and said and challenges to the reliability of things, and you are all under strictures that talk about correct or not false statements. So I just wanted to be sure that that is clearly understood, and that because, as the chairperson described, that we're going to continue with this research of ours because there's so many challenges to what is said to be the intention of the White House to cover issues so that they were to downplay the public risks. And the EPA press releases were changed or modified to downplay those risks. Why did the CEQ, Mr. Connaughton, decline to meet with the EPA Inspector General's investigators as they were preparing their report?
As I understand it, and you're now taking me back many years on this particular item, as I understand it, the Inspector General does not have authority to do oversight of offices outside of the EPA, and in particular the President's offices. So it was just an issue of the scope of the Inspector General's authority. That's as I understand it, but I was not closely attuned to all the ins and outs of that, but that was dealt with by the White House counsel's office.
Well, it's hard to see why that they wouldn't be included in the traditional IG's activities. EPA officials told the Inspector General that your staff deleted recommendations from that New York City residents obtain professional cleaning services for indoor areas. Why was the White House recommend removing those alerts from the statements?
Actually, Senator, I'm not in a position to recall very specific decisions about very specific pieces of text, some of which I was not directly involved in. There was an interface between Mr. Thernstrom of my office, who actually is a New Yorker as well, and the EPA on compiling the results of these broader interfaces among the public health professionals that I talked about. And so the effort between them was to do the best job they could, using their best professional judgment, to capture the information we're receiving and then communicate that in the most accurate and timely way they could, and then to update that information as it was obtained. And so any particular issue, items were added to the press releases, items were deleted to the press releases, items were changed in the press releases. EPA made changes, my office made changes, OSHA suggested changes. This was a typical process of interagency coordination on a communications document.
Yeah, but without laboring under the review of the process, what are the elements that were obviously changed, differentiated, that would cause people to make changes that said, well, one particular CEQ official was designated to work with the EPA to ensure that clearances were obtained through the National Security Council. Well, although EPA's position that World Trade Center area residents should obtain professional cleaning, EPA's press releases did not instruct residents to do so. Instead, they instructed residents to follow recommended and proper cleaning procedures. We asked the OCEMR Associate Administrator whether her office had considered advising the public through a press release that they needed to obtain professional cleaning. The Associate Administrator said it was in a press release. It was removed by CEQ contact. So there's so many differences here, Madam Chairman, that we're going to have to continue getting answers to these questions, if necessary, by writing, but also under the framework of forthrightness. And I want to close, Ms. Bodine. Your statement about America stronger than ever is almost gratuitous because you make that statement without looking at the total problems that this country has as a result of inaction in the post-9/11 days and further problems that we have. We have thousands of people doing security work. We have we have new findings that terrorists are after us. People are living in a fearful mode. In my judgment, and I love our country, and I respect so much those who did the heroic work to try and save lives down there. There is no insinuation that those things were not done properly. It was as a result of the decisions that were made by the administrations, I think, that put people in jeopardy. And so when you make a statement like that, America is stronger than ever, it doesn't really register. That's your opinion, and it would be best if you said, just registered it that way. Thank you.
I'm going to ask the witnesses' indulgence. I have to go vote. I'll be right back. We'll have one final round of questions for the witnesses before we move on to the next panel. Those of you who have never been to a Senate hearing before, this is the way it works. We never know exactly what we're going to have to do from minute to minute, but I really appreciate your being here. These are important issues, and I'll be back very shortly. Thank you very, very much for your patience. I want to just put a few things in the record before I ask my final questions. One, the ATSDR fact sheet on their study says, and I quote, "Results probably underestimate the levels of World Trade Center related material that were in Lower Manhattan immediately after 9/11. The sampling that was done and the results, I think, are very important for our continuing evaluation. Secondly, their is no consensus, it's been said, about whether a signature is possible, but there were 2 studies that I'd like to enter into the record that said a signature was possible. Unfortunately, we didn't act in a timely manner. The National Science Foundation funded work that has even found a defined dust signature in the sediments of New York Harbor. I would enter that into the record. And then the USGS released in 2005 preliminary studies demonstrating the ability to apply a World Trade Center dust signature that can be used to guide health-based research and remediation. And 2 final things on some of what has been discussed about the EPA's authority. The EPA has done indoor work in Libby, Montana since 1992. And in 1998, there was a presidential directive put in place putting EPA in charge of building decontamination. That's one of the reasons why it was quite bewildering to us that there wasn't an immediate acceptance of responsibility by the EPA. I can only assume that that presidential directive putting EPA in charge of indoor contamination was either not known of or disregarded. Now, I want to go back to Ms. Bodine because you spoke at some length about the national response plan that the EPA put into place, I believe you said in 2003. Is that correct?
Our national approach to response, correct.
Right. Well, then I would like to direct your attention to a report issued by the White House Homeland Security Advisor, Fran Townsend, in February 2006 about the administration's response to Katrina. And again, I quote from it. Federal officials could have improved the identification of environmental hazards and communication of appropriate warnings to emergency responders and the public. There must be a comprehensive plan to accurately and quickly communicate this critical information to the emergency responders and area residents who need it. Had such a plan existed, the mixed messages from federal, state, and local officials on the reentry into New Orleans could have been avoided. DHS, in coordination with EPA, HHS, OSHA, and DOE, should develop an integrated plan to quickly gather environmental data and provide the public and emergency responders the most accurate information available to decide whether it is safe to operate in a disaster environment or return after evacuation. This plan should address how to best communicate risk as well as determine who is accountable for making the determination that an area is safe. It should also address the need for adequate laboratory capacity to support response to all hazards. The plan should be completed in 180 days. Now, this was a finding in a report actually done by the White House, and it certainly raises questions about the comprehensiveness and adequacy of the plan that EPA put into place. Has EPA worked with the Department of Homeland Security to respond to these requests that Fran Townsend made in her assessment of what the government did after Katrina?
The agency has been working on a crisis communication plan. It is still in draft. It's still under review within the agency. There is also under the National Response Plan an emergency support function number 15, which is called External Affairs, which talks about the coordination of communications among all the agencies.
Well, Ms. Bodine, I mean, it has to be clear that if there were problems in communicating after 9/11, and as you have testified today, the agency began to take steps to try to have a better plan in place, and yet Katrina comes along, and the White House's own review finds that the communication system was inadequate, and it is now nearly 2 years after Katrina, and there is still not a communication plan. That has to raise serious doubts about the urgency with which the administration approaches these issues. And I would like to see a report from the EPA detailing where you are in response to this requirement to have a better plan, and a further report as soon as you can get that to the committee. Let me now turn to GAO, because GAO has done a very thorough job in trying to make sense out of many of the contradictory statements and actions that have marked the 9/11 experience. EPA's testimony notes a very low exceedance rate for asbestos in its first indoor test and clean program. Your testimony suggests that EPA used this data in a misleading way. Can you elaborate on this point? And does GAO have any other criticisms about EPA's risk communication after 9/11? Mr. Stevenson.
Well, first you have to remember that the first program, as was the second, was a voluntary program, and air samples were taken largely after the apartments had been cleaned. There was an option for residents to select test only or test and clean. 80% of them, I believe, chose the latter option, to clean first and then test. But you've got to assume that the others who tested only were not sitting around not cleaning their apartments. So our only point was that including that information with any public communication might have been heard differently by residents deciding to participate in the program or not.
Well, let me follow up on that. EPA's December 2006 press release announcing the current test and clean program included the following statement from Dr. George Gray, and I quote, "We believe the potential for exposure related to dust that may remain from the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings is low," end quote. In your judgment, is this statement by Dr. Gray supported by the data that the agency has collected?
Well, EPA has never done a comprehensive assessment of a single building. It's all based on voluntary samples from individual residences. It was done without benefit of looking for dust in HVAC areas, hard-to-access areas, et cetera. There was an aggressive test approach where they'd go into the apartment and blow the air up, but it wasn't clear which of the samples were done in that manner versus the samples simply taken after clean. So we think the data is quite inconclusive, and we don't think EPA has ever done a comprehensive assessment of the extent of damage in a building, let alone in the lower Manhattan area.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and I think that is the fair conclusion, that EPA has not done a comprehensive study. And I think it's clear that we don't have an accurate base of information to try to determine the causation behind a lot of the illnesses that people are suffering. We know people are getting sick, and I mentioned a number of studies in my opening statement, and here's another one. Just this month, a study published by researchers from the New York State Department of Health, the New York University School of Medicine, and the State University of New York at Albany concluded that residents who were exposed to contamination generated by the collapse that had been deposited in their homes had a significantly elevated rate of persistent airway disease. This study also found a strong correlation between reactive airway disease and exposures to indoor contamination for a period of 3 months or longer. I would like to enter this report into the record, because really this all comes back to my concern that we were never fully focused on what we needed to do at the time, and instead of going forward and saying, well, maybe in the immediate aftermath, which I absolutely agree was confusing and difficult, we missed some points, we weren't as clear as we needed to be, let's regroup and go forward. I mean, I think the evidence is very clear that we never did what was required. The EPA never did it, the Council on Environmental Quality never required it, and I think it is critical to do the oversight and have a detailed evaluation of EPA's readiness to respond to releases of hazardous substances in disasters. And Mr. Stevenson, I will soon submit a request to GAO to look into this issue of EPA preparedness more broadly, because my concern is intensified by the White House's own findings about EPA's failures in the wake of Katrina. And I don't know how any of us can sit here and be satisfied that if something disastrous happened tomorrow, we would not once again be facing, confusion, misstatements, failures that are going to cost people their lives and/or their health. So we will be submitting additional questions to each of the witnesses, and I look forward to your cooperation, because for me this is about how do we know we are doing better. That is a duty we owe to all of our citizens, and I think it is a duty we have not met. And I would also submit to the record the decision by Judge Batts in the case that I referenced in New York that found that Administrator Whitman certainly knew better than the statements that she made. On the contrary, the judge found, after looking at extensive evidence, that Governor Whitman's statements were deliberate and misleading, and in fact, they shock the conscience. No argument can be made that Whitman could not have understood from existing law that her conduct was unlawful. That is not me, that is not an inspector general, that is not a political person, that is a federal judge. So we have to do much better. We owe it to the people that look to their government to protect them, and I hope that we will be able to come up with some lessons learned that will plug holes in legislation and regulation. Senator Lautenberg, do you have any other questions for this panel?
Just if I might, and I thank the panel for their continuing to be with us. I want to ask Ms. Bodine about whether or not EPA today is prepared to make clear and consistent statements about the potential short and long-term risks posed by toxics and dust during an incident that would produce that kind of an after effect. Does EPA have a communications program in place to make that kind of statement on an issue of environmental protection, health, really alerting the people who could be affected to the risks that are posed by the consequence of this type?
Senator, I believe that we do, and I guess I would like to point out the review of EPA's communications during Katrina by our EPA Inspector General. There was a May 2nd, 2006 report. The title is EPA Provided Quality and Timely Information on Hurricane Katrina, Hazardous Materials Releases, and Debris Management. The agency did a fabulous job during Katrina in collecting data and making that data available to the public so that they could make decisions about their own safety.
We're in better shape today as a result of the post-Katrina data flow than we were at the time of the
yes,
9/11.
As has been described, at the time, the World Trade Center event was unprecedented in terms of the amount of environmental information we were collecting, analyzing, making available. Katrina was even greater in magnitude, and yet our agency employees have developed ways of creating portals, creating databases, getting information out far more quickly than we are able to during the World Trade Center response. So yes, we are in a better position to communicate.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Connaughton, we know that CEQ was involved in editing EPA press releases to minimize the concern that a more candid assessment of health risk from toxic dust might have done. Why does the White House why do they seem so focused on preventing the raw truth to the public. Why did you feel it necessary in CEQ to review press statements and change things that were in there that might have been more concerned, but more candid?
We don't.
Well, you did then, according to the reports that we see, that there were modifications of words and statements, that you were the final decision maker in terms of what was allowable, what could go to the press. There were lots of things that stressed the fact that no releases were to go out without the approval of the administration. Then that would have been you.
I disagree with your conclusion, Senator.
All right. Well, we're going to examine the record closely and maybe sharpen your recollection. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Lautenberg. Thanks to the panel. I appreciate all of you being here, and we will follow up with some specific requests that we hope will get your prompt attention. Thank you all. Our next panel, as they are coming forward, includes two people with direct experience in New York with respect to the issues we are examining. David Newman is from the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, and Nina Lavin is a resident of the World Trade Center area. And I thank them both very much for being part of this investigation and oversight hearing. Nina, we're going to start with you. And I thank you for taking your time to be with us, and I look forward to your testimony. Push the button in front of you so that the microphone goes on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Chairman Clinton, Senator Lautenberg, thank you for inviting me here to testify today. My name is Nina Lavin, and I have resided for the past 12 years at 105 Duane Street, which is situated 7 blocks directly north of the World Trade Center. I was home on September 11th and witnessed the collapse of both towers. Stunned, I evacuated that afternoon. The next day, I returned home to rescue my pets and collect a few belongings. 10 days later, when I returned home to stay, a fine, glittery dust had settled on virtually every surface and belonging throughout my apartment. The fabric wallpaper in our hallways had grayed throughout the building, and I also noticed dust accumulating around the doorframe of the entrance to my apartment, which looked completely different from the standard grimy dust I was familiar with from house cleaning. Christy Todd Whitman's statement on September 18, 2001, that the air is safe to breathe, set dangerous chaos in motion in Lower Manhattan. For 8 months, EPA insisted they had no responsibility for indoor cleanup. Instead, city agencies were left to take the lead. But city agencies weren't set up to handle the fallout of what was in truth a Superfund site. They also had long-standing, inbred relationships with real estate interests. The City Department of Environmental Protection allowed landlords to self-certify that their buildings were safe and looked the other way when landlords misused testing methods to obtain artificially low results or failed to test at all. When residents sought guidance on how to clean up from EPA, they were directed to the City Department of Health website, where they were instructed to clean up World Trade Center dust themselves by wet wiping, and that's what I did. Later, to protect myself as best I could, I also purchased a HEPA vacuum cleaner and ran a HEPA air filtration device. For months, noxious fumes from the site entered our homes, so that even inside my apartment, the fumes were so intense, it was as though I had stuck my head inside an oil drum full of burning industrial materials. Consequently, I experienced headaches, burning in my eyes, nose, and throat, and developed a painful, hacking cough. By July of 2002, I was diagnosed with chronic bronchitis by a pulmonologist at NYU Medical Center and was moved out of my apartment for almost 10 months with funding from FEMA. Currently, I am receiving treatment at the Bellevue World Trade Center Environmental Health Clinic. Today, 5.5 years after the event, like so many other residents, I have sinusitis and esophagitis, which are conditions of chronic inflammation, and acid reflux, all of which are now recognized as being linked to World Trade Center exposures. These symptoms are not diminishing, and while they may not be life-threatening, no one knows what's in store down the road. The big questions remain: what were we exposed to, for how long, and are we still being exposed? Unfortunately, we have no answers to any of these questions, in large part because the EPA refused to take its responsibility for assessing and cleaning up indoor contamination. In 2002, since EPA wasn't doing any indoor testing at that point to protect residents, I took matters into my own hands. I privately hired a certified industrial hygienist to conduct asbestos testing inside my apartment. My building was constructed in the early 1990s and therefore can be presumed to have been constructed free of asbestos-containing materials. Testing using the microvac method revealed highly elevated concentrations of asbestos in dust clumps formed in the front doorway of my apartment, which opens into an interior hallway of the building. Significant but lesser levels were found deep inside the 2 HVAC units. Because of these findings, I chose to participate in the voluntary cleanup program EPA offered in 2002. I'm not a scientist, but common sense tells me this program was woefully inadequate. First, the cleanup was voluntary, and many of my neighbors took this as a sign that participation was unnecessary and a waste of time. Secondly, cleanup of building common areas, hallways, lobbies, etc., was entirely left to the discretion of building owners, posing a serious recontamination scenario. Third, cleaning of HVAC systems was flawed and based exclusively upon an unscientific evaluation of dust color. Very few HVACs were ever cleaned. And finally, the cleanups were performed by seemingly untrained workers using poor equipment. In my apartment, the cleaning crew used cheap, dark-colored, non-absorbent synthetic bathroom towels, which moved the wet dirt around without picking it up. Luckily, though, on the advice of cleanup professionals I had spoken with, I had a backup plan: Huggy wipes. I gave these to the cleaners, and once they began using them, the dust and dirt started coming off and coming off the same surfaces that had previously been cleaned using the cheap synthetic towels. 6 months after the EPA cleanup of my apartment, I had testing done again for asbestos, lead, and numerous heavy metal analytes. While asbestos was found in a low level in one window well, the lead was found to be elevated in both windows and in one of them just below the cutoff point for which immediate lead remediation would have been required. To quote the written report on the finding of heavy metals, the heavy metal sampling revealed the presence of various heavy metals found in the apartment. Published standards for acceptable levels of heavy metals on surfaces within the space do not exist. Standards have not been developed because the presence of most of these contaminants is neither a normal nor an acceptable condition in commercial or residential space. It is now 2007. Is the air safe to breathe? No one knows. Lessons learned by EPA? I've learned the latest EPA cleanup plan is as poor as the last. Thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you very much for your very thorough and informative testimony. I want to turn now to David Newman, and I want to thank Mr. Newman for your work on the EPA World Trade Center Expert Technical Review Panel and for all of your efforts to address these important and difficult issues in New York. Mr. Newman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairperson Clinton and Senator Lautenberg. My name is David Newman. I am an industrial hygienist with the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health. I also had the privilege of serving on the EPA World Trade Center Expert Technical Review Panel. The attacks of 9/11/01 produced not only an initial catastrophic loss of life, but also a lingering environmental disaster, with adverse health consequences for responders at Ground Zero as well as for workers and residents in a much larger geographic area. Toxic contaminants were dispersed over a wide area of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn and beyond. We now know that those caught in the dust cloud and/or those responding at the World Trade Center site in the first hours or days have higher incidences and greater severities of health impacts. Presumably, the intensity and duration of exposure and lack of respiratory protection were significant factors. These early exposures were unavoidable. However, EPA's inappropriately reassuring pronouncements that the air is safe to breathe were counterproductive to efforts at implementation of respiratory protection programs by employers and counterproductive to respirator use by rescue, recovery, and cleanup workers. EPA's actions contributed to unnecessary exposures to toxic contaminants by thousands of workers and volunteers. Similarly, EPA's risk communications served as disincentives to landlords, employers, and government agencies regarding the suitability of conducting indoor environmental testing and cleanup. The failure of EPA to provide environmental assessment and cleanup in commercial and government buildings, coupled with the agency's limited and inadequate sampling and cleanup in residences, is likely to have subjected area workers and area residents to additional unnecessary and avoidable exposures. Because EPA contended for the first 8 months that it had no legal responsibility for addressing indoor contaminants, sampling and remediation efforts during that time occurred only on a limited, haphazard, and often ineffectual basis. The single EPA indoor cleanup effort was modest, limited to residences, and of questionable effectiveness and scientific merit. The current EPA program fundamentally replicates the prior program and disregards virtually all of the recommendations of the members of the WTC panel. This program, like its predecessor, is technically and scientifically flawed and is unlikely to adequately identify or clean up 9/11 contaminants if and where they still exist. The geographic boundaries of the current program are arbitrarily and not scientifically determined. EPA used aerial photographs of debris deposition to establish the boundaries. However, aerial photographs do not show the invisible smaller particles that are of considerable health concern and are likely to have been dispersed over a wider geographic area. The World Trade Center expert panel strongly recommended that the program's geographic boundaries be expanded further north in Manhattan and east into parts of Brooklyn. EPA agreed to do so in May 2005, but has reneged on that commitment. There is no scientific justification for the exclusion of workplaces. There is no evidence that workplaces were impacted differently or less severely than residences. There is no evidence that a significant number or any number of workplaces benefited from employer-conducted cleanup efforts, or that such efforts were effective. Most workplaces were not and will never be tested or cleaned. The EPA program is designed to avoid finding contaminants. It is biased towards sampling cleaner areas, and it de-emphasizes sampling in dirtier areas. It excludes testing in precisely the spaces that are most likely to harbor residual contaminants, such as mechanical ventilation systems and ceiling plenums. This is problematic for 2 reasons. First, maintenance workers regularly access these spaces and inadvertently disturb settled dust, resuspending it into the air where it is available for inhalation by workers and tenants. Second, contaminants in a mechanical ventilation system can lie dormant indefinitely. If they are disturbed at a later date by maintenance activities or other causes, the ventilation system will provide a very efficient mechanism for distribution of contaminants throughout occupied indoor spaces. The EPA program, the current program, diverges significantly from established regulatory and best work practices. The plan establishes different triggers for cleanup of asbestos in different parts of residences. It permits higher levels of asbestos to remain on top of bookcases or behind large objects of furniture. It is ill-advised to remove asbestos from the living room floor and allow it to remain behind the refrigerator. City and state asbestos regulations require that all areas of a contaminated space be cleaned to a single protective standard. The potential consequences of these shortcomings are worrisome. Scientists may receive skewed data on the extent of geographic dispersion of 9/11 contaminants. Residents may receive inaccurate assessments of the presence or absence of 9/11 contaminants in their living spaces and may receive inadequately supported assurances of safety. And workers and employers will continue to lack effective access to environmental testing and cleanup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newman. I want to give you a chance to respond to the assertions made by the members of the first panel, because clearly your experience, your expertise, and your testimony today directly contradict many of the claims that were made by the panelists. And I'd like to ask you to respond to what you heard this morning.
Thank you. Let me start in two areas. One is the... Is that better? No? Is this better?
Move it a little bit towards you, Mr. Newman. Yeah. Did the light go on when you hit the...
It's a red light now.
Got it.
Now it's on? Okay. Sorry about that. First, with regard to the comments of Mr. Connaughton, I'm quoting here from, selectively, of course, from a September 13th, 2001 email. It's an OSHA email, and it says, quote, "A conference call was held this morning with EPA, regional and national, as well as representatives from the White House. They were concerned about the public understanding of the sample results that are forthcoming and our ability to reassure them with respect to air quality. The secondary purpose of the call was to discuss the financial market and who we can work toward allowing them into their buildings." From a memo of 9/28/01, EPA stated that by orders of the White House, the EPA webpage is not being updated with current sample results. So there are clear indications that the White House participated in discussions and decisions as to how to massage the data that was available to them at that time. With regard to the ability and responsibility of the EPA to address the issue of indoor contamination, the National Contingency Plan is very clear, and it assigns the authority to respond to the release of hazardous substances to EPA. It very specifically authorizes EPA to enter any vessel, facility, establishment, or other place, property, or location and conduct, complete, operate, and maintain any response actions. Further, the NCP applies to and is in effect when the Federal Response Plan and some or all of its emergency support functions are activated. That is, the activation of the Federal, or now the National Response Plan, and its emergency support functions does not override or cancel EPA's responsibility for indoor contamination. And this position was confirmed shortly after 9/11 by testimony given before Congress by then EPA Administrator Christine Whitman, who stated, "Under the provisions of Presidential Decision Directive 62, EPA is assigned lead responsibility for cleaning up buildings and other sites contaminated by chemical or biological agents as a result of an act of terrorism."
I will put into the record the 1998 Presidential Decision Directive, PDD 62, which did task EPA with the leadership role in cleaning up buildings and other sites contaminated by chemical or biological agents as a result of an act of terrorism. Now, Mr. Newman, GAO's testimony and their written reports suggest that EPA remains poorly prepared to address indoor contamination issues. Do you share this view, and what is your view of EPA's state of preparedness?
Well, I have to start my, begin my remarks by clarifying that I do not work for EPA, and I am not privy to internal discussions or documents that may exist within EPA. But if we use as a yardstick for for lessons learned, a comparison of EPA's sampling plans in 2002 and EPA sampling plans in 2007, I see little, if any, significant change that indicates any lessons learned whatsoever.
And Mr. Newman, would you describe for the committee and the record your work on the expert technical review panel, how you thought that the EPA was responding, and at what point the panel disbanded, and for what reason?
The broad mandate as you know, of the WTC Expert Technical Review Panel was to assess any remaining health risks posed from the events of 9/11 and to determine appropriate approaches to deal with questions of public health. The panel, I think, in my opinion, was faced with three major broad goals. One was to assess the extent, if any, of remaining indoor contaminants. Second was to devise and that was for through a sampling plan. And second was to devise an appropriate cleanup plan to address any remaining contamination. And the third was to address broad issues of public health related to the events of 9/11. We engaged in extensive collegial discussion over a lengthy period of time on these and other issues, and the ultimate unfortunate result was the determination by EPA to disregard virtually all of the suggestions and concerns expressed by the panel, shut down the panel, and proceed with a sampling plan devised by EPA that was not reflective or responsive to the discussions and recommendations of the panel.
At any time, did anyone from EPA advise you or advise the panel that they were disregarding your recommendations for financial reasons?
The issue of finances was a big and continuing one throughout the course of the panel's meetings. Early on, a number of panel members, including myself, but also others, questioned, asked for some guidance from EPA as to how we were to structure our discussions with regard to the question of finances. That is, are we operating under budgetary constraints in attempting to design a sampling and cleanup program, or are we to provide the best scientific advice that we were able to come up with, disregarding any financial constraints? They told us at the beginning and on several occasions thereafter that we were to disregard any budgetary constraints. However, during the course of the panel process, it became very clear. In fact, the representative from FEMA, who sat in an ex officio position on the panel, told panel members at a panel meeting that the budget was in fact predetermined and limited to the $7 million remaining in the FEMA fund from the prior cleanup, at which point we again attempted to enter into some substantive discussions as to how, should a sampling and cleanup plan be devised, how budgetary constraints would impact on the design of that plan. And we were again told not to consider those factors. And then at the very end, as we know today, that virtually the entire design of the plan is limited precisely by those budgetary constraints.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Senator Lautenberg.
Keep us long, Madam Chairman, but Mr. Newman and Ms. Levin, thank you very much for your testimony. The contradiction to what we heard earlier is a contrast that has to be noted, and it seemed to me obvious that there was an attempt by the administration to downplay the risks, and you attributed, Mr. Newman, I think primarily to the financial side, but I think there was some other sinister motive that was there, and that was to not look like we weren't ready for anything, that it was done in many ways in an arrogant and almost boastful manner. I mean, and when we see that there was any denial that there was an attempt to influence the press releases, it just don't square with what we see. Contrary cautionary statements. This was in the IG's report in a draft version of September 13, 2001. Press releases were removed and replaced with more reassuring statements. For example, second clause of the caption of the draft press release was noted that EPA was testing for environmental hazards was replaced with a statement reassuring the public about environmental hazards. Did you see that in your work on your committee in assessing what had taken place there? Was there anything obvious to you that said they just didn't want people to know what was out there? Now, let me remove the coloration. You do it yourself. Go ahead.
The panel did not review or assess EPA's early risk communications to the public. So with regard to that aspect of your question, I can't answer. I don't have an answer.
Okay.
But the panel did struggle with the broad mandate of assessing any remaining risks to public health. And the form that struggle took was there were many members of the public who expressed in the public comment period at panel meetings a desire to not only address the issue of whether there was any residual contamination and the implementation of a sampling and cleanup program, but to also investigate the broader issues of public health from 9/11 with, for example, the lack, at least initially, the lack of government oversight as to the demolition of heavily contaminated high-rise buildings, the issue of various impacted populations who were exhibiting adverse health consequences and their inability to get access to proper medical care, the questions of additional research and funding for research that was needed, and these issues, which were raised by members of the public during the meetings as well as by panel members, including myself and others, were short-circuited, and the panel did not consider those issues.
When you said that the EPA used a helicopter, if I understood, to assess the spread of the dust, is that?
They used aerial photographs. I don't know whether it was
how far did any of your research tell you physically was the spread of the dust from the fallen building?
Well, as a number of people have testified today, we don't have that data. It's now almost 6 years later. There is, as the gentleman from GAO testified, there is yet to be a comprehensive, targeted, science-based assessment of the geographic extent of the dispersion of World Trade Center contaminants. So we do not have that answer. So anybody who gets up here, myself included, and says that it was widely dispersed or that it was not widely dispersed, that's not a science-based statement. We do not have that data. Certainly, there's the potential for wider dispersion, and we acknowledge that potential, and we are concerned about that. But in terms of data, we don't have it.
What I'd like to ask, how many people have died in the aftermath of 9/11 from their exposure to the dust and smoke? And have those deaths been officially recognized? Do you have any evidence to that effect?
We have a fairly large number of anecdotally reported deaths. That is, deaths reported through the media, deaths reported by family members, et cetera. And these are deaths of people who are, by their exposure history at and around Ground Zero, are presumed to have had exposure to 9/11 contaminants. However, in terms of clinically confirmed deaths, the number is very, very low. We have a recent one that was referred to by Senator Clinton. We have, of course, police officer Zadroga. We do not have in...
How about the number who have put in their request for attention to their problems? Respiratory, people unable to work. There's a substantial number of people from the fire department who were unable to continue with their jobs. Is that
Absolutely. In terms of the medical monitoring programs that exist, that's the World Trade Center Medical Monitoring Program and the New York City Fire Department Medical Program as the two primary. In this case, we have tens of thousands of cases of clinically confirmed, clinically diagnosed, persistent respiratory and other medical conditions. Absolutely.
Madam Chairman, thanks for conducting this hearing and for bringing the attention that it deserves to the public forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lautenberg. Ms. Levin, I just wanted to thank you for coming to testify and also to ask you to describe your experience with the Bellevue program, because as I said at the very beginning, we are finally going to be able to provide some federal support for the medical treatment program at Bellevue for residents. That has not been included before. We were able to obtain that in the last 48 hours as a part of the appropriations bill. But would you describe, if you can recall, when you first went there and what the experience there was and what their diagnosis and treatment for you has been going forward?
I first went there, I think it was in March. It was a February or March. I don't recall the precise date. I'm under the treatment of the director, Dr. Reibman, and so far I'm very pleased with the program because it has been specifically designed. The doctors are coordinated there, and that's really a key element in treatment of the different symptoms of what have now what are now known as World Trade Center syndrome. So, and I think it's essential for them to have long-term funding, and I hope that they'll get more because that will allow them to draw some of the best and the newest doctors, the strongest talent.
I thank you for that, and I would like to ask both of you to respond to maybe further written questions as we review the testimony. Sure. It would be useful to try to help complete the record in that way. And I also want to thank you for representing so many people who have been afflicted by, in the first instance, their exposures, and in the second instance, the failure to accurately describe the toxic dangers and then to respond to the legitimate health needs that tens of thousands of people, as Mr. Newman said, are confronting. I am very grateful to everyone who participated in the hearing, and I want to thank you again, and we will continue with this. As I said in the beginning, Congressman Nadler will hold a companion hearing next week to focus on some additional issues, particularly concerned with the city and the city's response. So the hearing is adjourned. I think we'll have a press opportunity, because I know there was a lot of press here, just up here in front of the dais, and maybe Mr. Newman and Ms. Lavin could join. What, here, I can, got it? I'll just put it up here. Okay. Okay. You guys give me the go-ahead. Everybody ready? Okay, thank you very much. I think as you followed the testimony this morning, it was clear that we are still confronted by contradictions, misstatements, denials about the role that the federal government played in the information that was released in the aftermath of the attacks of 9/11 and the significance of the exposures to the toxins that were released into the air. I am determined to pursue this, not only because I think the people who were affected deserve the truth, but also because we need to make sure that the government is prepared in the event of another terrorist attack or a natural disaster. It was abundantly clear that many of the claims about the improvements that have been made since 9/11 have not been borne out. Testimony was directly contradicted by the White House's own review of the response by EPA and others to the disaster of Katrina. There were three major developments that were included in this hearing. The first was the GAO report of preliminary findings as to their investigation of the EPA's cleaning and testing program in Lower Manhattan. The full report will be out in the fall, but the preliminary data and conclusions presented today offer a very different picture from what the EPA and the White House would like us to believe. And I appreciate the thoroughness of the GAO's report. That is why I have decided to ask them to do another report that will look at the GAO's level of preparedness with respect to future disasters. We need to sort out, and apparently the administration is either unwilling or incapable of doing it for us, what they've done, how prepared they are, and to determine what changes might be needed both on the basis of the reaction or failure of reaction to 9/11 and to Katrina with respect to legislative and regulatory changes that would be required to plug any gaps. But as was clear in the testimony, the EPA didn't even pay attention to pre-existing governmental authority, in particular the presidential directive putting the EPA in charge of indoor contamination was disregarded and denied consistently. Finally, one of my goals has been to include the residents like Nina and thousands of others who were directly affected because of their exposure during the collapse of the towers and in the days and weeks later because of both the ambient air condition and the indoor contamination in their homes, to give them the opportunity to have federal support for the medical monitoring and treatment that they are receiving or should receive. The program at Bellevue has taken responsibility for dealing with residents, just as the programs at Mount Sinai and the fire department and the other related medical programs have focused on the workers, the first responders, the volunteers. So I'm very pleased that in the Appropriations Committee work yesterday, we were able to obtain a commitment of $55 million additional dollars for the monitoring and treatment of those who were affected, and for the first time to include residents in that monitoring and treatment. So I am grateful to everyone who has worked so hard on this, and particularly to the many New Yorkers who have made this a real cause. Day in and day out, they've been willing to stand up and make clear the failures of our government and their continuing request for answers. And I particularly want to acknowledge the widower and sister of Felicia Dunn-Jones, because in response to Senator Lautenberg's last question, she has been determined by the medical examiner in New York City to have died from the initial dust cloud that she was caught in on 9/11. It has long been my concern that many thousands were affected and many people will die as a direct result of their exposures in the immediate aftermath in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11. And I think this was an attack on our country, and I believe our federal government should step up and take care of the people who were directly impacted by this attack. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yes.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could comment on Mayor Bloomberg's decision to leave the Republican Party.
Let's start with this issue first, okay? I mean, there'll be plenty of time for politics. It's an obsession in this town, but you know, I represent tens of thousands of people who are suffering and who have died, and I'd like to at least have a chance to see what reporters who have followed this issue might wish to ask. Yes.
Senator, you asked the EPA to come back and retest those apartments. You had them set up the technical panel, and you watched them spend 2 years coming up with a plan that the GAO today said was flawed scientifically and flawed in every other way. Their reporting on the first round of testing was misleading, and we know now that only 295 people have responded. So what would you say to the people who live in Lower Manhattan who are concerned about this and who are hoping that something would be resolved?
That I share their anger, their outrage, and their concern. The expert technical panel that Mr. Newman served on did a very good job in coming forth with recommendations. Had they been followed, I think we would be here talking about what the EPA had done to remedy their deficiencies in previous years. Unfortunately, the EPA disregarded the specific recommendations. They imposed an arbitrary limit on how much money they would be willing to spend to conduct the testing and cleaning. And as a result, I think residents have an understandable reluctance to participate in what they view as a waste of time. I would hope that we will be able to remedy this. That's one of the reasons why I'm holding hearings. I had a previous hearing in the Help Committee. It's why Congressman Nadler continues to press this, because we are hoping to get a better response and to try to require the EPA to make amends. You know how difficult it is in this administration to get that done. But at the very least, we want to expose the deficiencies and the denial that the EPA and the White House and others have engaged in now for nearly 6 years. And we hope that we will be able to try to make amends, at least through medical monitoring and treatment of those who have been affected, and if possible, to bring more resources to bear on the continuing problem of contamination.
Senator?
Yes.
An awful lot of these people who are sick are city employees. Can you explain why you're not examining the decisions that city leaders, including the mayor, made at that time?
Well, they have been examined, and Congressman Nadler is going after the information we need from the city. I held a hearing in Lower Manhattan back in February 2002 with Senator Lieberman to begin to try to find out from city employees what happened. And I will never forget that the city at that time testified they did not have responsibility, that the EPA had responsibility. The EPA in turn said they didn't have responsibility, it was up to the city. So for years, everybody has been basically pointing fingers at somebody else. And what we are trying to do is to sort out all of the competing claims and to try to figure out what should have happened, what could have happened. The presidential directive that I put into the record gave the EPA authority over indoor contamination, which they did not willingly accept at the time. I remember one of the city employees saying, you know, the Department of Environmental Conservation, we don't do air, we do water. And, you know, it was a very blunt and honest statement from a city employee about that's not our job. So one of the problems has been this unwillingness to accept responsibility. And it started at the very beginning, and unfortunately, as we saw today, it continues. Yes?
Should Rudy Giuliani, should he be brought in and testify under oath on what he knew and what happened under his administration?
Well, I think that we're trying to piece this together going forward. I believe, and maybe somebody knows, which witnesses Congressman Nadler is going to have before him. Do we know that, Chet? Does anybody know who the city, is the city sending? It's also federally focused. You know, we are attempting to try to first, within our authority and our jurisdiction, deal with the federal agencies because they're the ones who we fund, they're the ones that we have oversight over, but clearly the lessons learned have to extend to the city as well.
Yes. During the hearing, you told Susan Bodine that you want to get more information from the agency regarding their communication plans, and you would like them to issue some sort of report on that. Could you elaborate a little bit more as to what you're looking for?
Well, we are looking for information about what their plans actually are, because I think her testimony painted a pretty rosy picture about how after 9/11 they worked to put into place plans. They adopted a new national plan in 2003, and there were a lot of very flowery statements made about how well prepared they were. But the fact is that after Katrina, there was no plan. And even the White House itself, in their internal investigation, and they're hardly known as a very tough investigator of themselves, concluded that the EPA and the other federal agencies did not have an adequate communications plan. So let's see what it is on paper. When I asked her to respond to that, they said they were in draft. Well, honest to goodness, how many years does it take to come up with a communications plan that will give the American people accurate information that they can act upon and that they can believe, and a level of competence in our government in responding to these disasters? So we're going to press very hard to get that information, but as a check on it, we're asking the GAO to conduct their own oversight as to how prepared the EPA is with respect to communications that will give people a more accurate basis than they were given either in 9/11 or in Katrina. Anything else on this issue? Okay.
So can you respond to Mayor Bloomberg's decision to leave the Republican Party and what you think of a possible presidential race between 3 New Yorkers?
Well, I am not surprised by anyone leaving the Republican Party these days. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, my friends. Let's get a picture. Okay. Witness. And so, stalwart in this. Thank you all very much. Okay.
We take you now live to George Washington University, where in just a few minutes a discussion will get underway on the U.S. refugee program, on academics, government officials, and refugees participating. It will be going on in just a few minutes. And also at the U.S. Capitol today, where both the House and Senate are in session, the House continues work on fiscal year 2008 federal spending. Members plan to finish energy and water spending and may start on the State Department and Foreign Operations spending bill. The Senate today continues work on energy legislation, live House coverage on C-SPAN, and the Senate on C-SPAN 2. While we wait for this discussion on refugees to get underway, here's a portion of this morning's Washington Journal.
Start with the New York Daily News, his hometown paper, and the headline reads,